Welcome to This Explainer. So today, we're going to completely challenge a lot of what you probably think you know about one of history's absolutely most notorious groups, the Vikings. We're diving into the source material to go way beyond the bloodshed and the battles because, well, as you'll see, the real picture is just so much more complex. Let's jump right in. Okay, I want you to take just a second and actually visualize this. When I say the word Viking, what pops into your head? If you're like most of us, you're probably picturing this massive, bearded guy wielding a giant battle axe, eyes just wild with bloodlust, stepping off a boat to pillage a village, right? It's an incredibly powerful image. It's one that's been literally burned into our collective imagination for generations. But, as we're about to see, that image, it's missing almost the entire picture. So here's our first major revelation. The term Viking itself, it actually isn't what you think it is. The word comes from Old Norse, and it refers to an activity, specifically piracy or raiding. It's basically a job description. It is not an ethnic identity or a nationality or a race. The folks who went a Viking primarily came from Scandinavia, modern-day Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. So to say someone was a Viking was a lot more like saying they were a pirate rather than saying they were from a specific country.
Section 1. Myth versus reality.
There's just a massive gap between pop culture and actual history here. On one side, sure, we've got the Hollywood caricature of the mindless killer, but the historical reality, it's vastly different. The vast majority of people in Scandinavian society were actually organized, settled, and agrarian. We're talking about farmers tending to their land, highly skilled artisans crafting these beautiful pieces of jewelry and tools, and really ambitious traders building vast economic networks. Raiding was honestly just a tiny fraction of what their society actually did. And look, we absolutely have to talk about the helmet. The iconic horned helmet is a complete fabrication, no way around it. Our sources highlight that this is actually a 19th century myth. It was dreamed up by European theater artists who just wanted to make opera singers look, a bit more dramatic on stage. Historical Vikings didn't actually wear them. I mean, think about it. Horns would be incredibly dangerous to the person wearing them in close combat.
Section 2. The driving forces.
So you might be wondering, if they were mostly just farmers, why did they turn to raiding in the first place? Well, it really comes down to some harsh environmental realities. Scandinavia is notoriously cold, right? Extreme winters, which put some really strict limits on agriculture. But despite that lack of arable land, they experienced this massive population boom. So they didn't just take to the seas out of pure bloodlust. Actually, it was a desperate necessity. They literally just didn't have enough food or land to survive without expanding outward. Section 3. Inside Viking society. Now, in stark contrast to the rest of Europe during the Middle Ages, Viking society was surprisingly progressive when it came to women's rights. Women actually had the right to request a divorce, they could inherit property, and they could even run their own businesses. And this immense respect for women, it was even reflected in their spirituality. Just look at the Valkyries and their mythology, these fierce, incredibly powerful female figures who literally chose who lived and died in battle. They were just miles ahead of their European contemporaries in this area.
Section 4. Norse religion and beliefs.
This was a deeply spiritual pagan culture where stories were initially passed down orally from generation to generation. And here's the crazy part. Their ancient religion is actually still deeply embedded in our lives today through this fascinating etymological link. The days of our modern work week are literally named after the Norse gods. Tuesday comes from Tyr, the god of war. Wednesday, that originates from Woden, which is another name for Odin, the Allfather. Thursday is, obviously, Thor's Day, and Friday is named for the goddess Frigg, or Freya. So every single time you check your calendar, you're looking at a direct legacy of Viking culture. How cool is that? But it wasn't all just cool mythology. Alongside those stories, they practiced a ritual known as blot. This involved animal, and occasionally even human, sacrifices that were performed to appease these very gods. It really highlights the striking duality in their culture, doesn't it? On one hand, you have a society championing early legal rights, while simultaneously engaging in what we today would view as incredibly dark, brutal religious practices.
Section 5. Voyages and expeditions.
Now, pretty much their entire expansion hinged on their unmatched navigational prowess, specifically the engineering of the longship, or drakkar, These things had a perfectly symmetrical design, which meant they could reverse direction instantly. But more importantly, their shallow draft meant they could cross violent, deep oceans and then just sail right up shallow inland rivers to strike totally unsuspecting targets. That's exactly what happened with the shocking raid on the Lindisfarne Monastery back in 793.
But the northern seas are famously treacherous, right? They're often completely covered in blinding fog. So, how did they navigate without a compass? The secret was actually the sunstone. This was a special polarizing crystal that could catch and refract light, allowing them to pinpoint the sun's exact location in the sky, even on completely overcast days. I mean, talk about a massive technological advantage for the time.
And that technology really paid off on a global scale. Starting with those early European raids in the 8th century, they pushed further and further out to discover and then settle Iceland and eventually Greenland. And ultimately, they successfully crossed the Atlantic and reached the shores of North America. That is an absolute marvel of human exploration, and they achieved it a full 500 years before Christopher Columbus was even born.
Section 6. Fall and Legacy. So how did it all end? Well, the decline of the Vikings wasn't actually marked by a single catastrophic defeat. Instead, it was more like a slow process of assimilation. Over time, European Christianity spread through Scandinavia, gradually replacing their pagan beliefs. They started forming internal peace treaties, establishing solid kingdoms, and, well, as the global economic landscape shifted, trading just became much more lucrative and a lot more stable than raiding. They didn't really disappear. They simply blended into the very European cultures they had once terrorized. Now, historians formally mark the end of the Viking Age at the year 1066. That was the year of the famous Battle of Hastings. But here is the really fascinating twist. That battle was actually won by the Normans, who were themselves direct descendants of Viking settlers in France. So, in a way, it was an era that ended at the hands of its own descendants. And that brings us to their true legacy. The fear of Viking raids was just so intense that all these fragmented, squabbling European kingdoms finally realized they couldn't survive alone. The Vikings essentially acted as these extreme geopolitical catalysts. They literally forced Europe to organize, centralize, and build the strong, unified states that laid the very groundwork for the modern map as we know it. Which leaves us with this final thought. Based on everything we've unpacked from the sources today, their advanced rights for women, their totally unmatched naval technology, their reach across the entire globe, and the way they basically inadvertently forged unified nations, I'm going to leave it to you to decide. Were they just the barbarians of the Middle Ages, or were they, in fact, the true architects of modern Europe? Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and definitely keep questioning history.